The HR director's office had that particular kind of quiet that only exists when someone is about to ruin your day and has rehearsed exactly how to do it. I'd been in that building for 22 years. Started when my daughter was in diapers. Back when the company was still small enough that the CEO knew everyone's coffee order. I was the one who built the compliance monitoring system from the ground up, wrote half the original code myself, back when that meant something. Over 2 decades, I'd watched the company grow from a scrappy regional lender into a mid-size fintech operation with offices in 4 states and an IPO on the horizon. My name is on 3 internal patents. My fingerprints are on every major system audit since 2009. None of that was mentioned in the termination meeting. What was mentioned? We're restructuring the compliance team to better align with our growth trajectory. That was how my boss's boss, a man named Sloane, who joined the company 14 months ago from a consulting firm, explained it. He used the phrase growth trajectory 4 times in 6 minutes. I counted. The other man in the room was introduced to me as Kendall. Late 20s, sharp suit, the kind of handshake that's trying too hard. He was, Sloane explained, going to be leading the Compliance Innovation Initiative going forward. I recognized the title. It was a version of my title, with the word innovation inserted to make it sound newer. Kendall, I would later find out, was Sloane's nephew by marriage. I didn't make a scene. I never make scenes. I thanked them both, signed what I was legally required to sign, and asked about the transition timeline. Sloane looked almost disappointed that I wasn't going to cry. He told me I had until the end of the week to hand off my documentation. I spent the next 3 days doing the most thorough handoff in the history of that company. Every system, every protocol, every recurring audit flag. I documented it all. Not because I felt generous, because I knew exactly what was coming, and I wanted there to be a paper trail proving I'd warned them. On my last day, I packed a box. Coffee mug, a photo from my daughter's graduation, a small cactus I'd been keeping alive on my windowsill for 11 years. On my way out, I stopped by Kendall's new desk, my old desk, and told him there were 3 open SEC review flags in the quarterly reporting module that needed to be cleared before the pre-IPO audit window opened in 6 weeks. He was on his phone. He looked up at me the way young people look at someone's grandfather when he starts talking about something they don't care about. "I'll loop in the team," he said, and went back to his screen. I left the building, drove to a diner on Route 9 that I'd been eating at since before Kendall was born, and ordered the patty melt. My hands weren't shaking. I want to be clear about that. They weren't shaking at all. The thing about compliance work is that most people don't understand what it actually is until it stops being done correctly. They think it's paperwork. They think it's a checkbox operation, something you hand to a junior analyst in a piece of software and call it managed. What it actually is, a continuous living relationship between your internal operations and a very specific set of federal expectations. The SEC doesn't care about your growth trajectory. The CFPB doesn't care about your innovation initiative. What they care about is whether your reported numbers match your actual numbers, whether your disclosed risk exposure matches your actual risk exposure, and whether the people signing off on those disclosures understood what they were signing. I had spent 22 years being the person who made sure the answer to all 3 questions was yes. The 3 flags I'd mentioned to Kendall weren't catastrophic on their own. They were the kind of thing that, if caught and corrected early, amounts to an internal adjustment and a footnote. If not caught, if they made it into the S1 filing, if the underwriters didn't flag them, if the SEC reviewers pulled the right thread, they had the potential to become something considerably worse. I knew about them because I discovered them 6 weeks before my termination. I had already drafted a correction protocol. It was sitting in a folder on the shared drive, labeled clearly, with my name on it. I did not follow up after leaving. That was not my job anymore. My wife asked me, the first weekend after I left, how I was doing. We were sitting on the back deck, evening, the kind of late autumn light that makes everything look a little more significant than it is. "I'm fine," I said. "You've said that 4 times today, and each time it sounds less convincing. I'm processing." She handed me a beer and didn't push it, which is one of the 1,000 reasons I've been married to her for 28 years. What I was actually doing, in the privacy of my own head, was running through the timeline. The pre-IPO audit window opened in 6 weeks. The S-1 filing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. The roadshow would follow. I knew the schedule because I had helped build it. I had sat in planning meetings for 2 years watching that timeline take shape. The flags I'd mentioned to Kendall existed in the reporting module I'd built. The correction required access to 3 separate subsystems, an understanding of how they interacted, and knowledge of a manual override process that I had implemented in 2019 and that I was reasonably certain no one else on the team knew existed. I did not reach back out to offer help. I want to be precise about that. I am not the kind of person who sabotages anything. I documented everything. I flagged everything. I said goodbye clearly. What happened next was not my responsibility, but I did keep my phone on. The first call came 4 weeks after my last day. It was Sloane. I let it go to voicemail. He said something about a systems question and asked me to call back at my earliest convenience. His voice had a specific quality to it that I recognized, not quite panic yet, but the register just before panic, the one where someone realizes the map they're using doesn't match the territory. I didn't call back. 2 days later, his assistant called. Then Sloane again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be someone from IT. Then Sloane again, twice in one afternoon. By the end of the week, I had 11 voicemails, all variations on a theme. Something wasn't working. They needed clarification. Could I just answer one question? I've worked in compliance for 22 years. I know what one question means when a pre-IPO audit window is open. It means the flags surfaced. It means someone in the review process found them and is asking about them. It means Kendall's team, whoever they are, cannot explain what they're looking at without the institutional memory that walked out the door 6 weeks ago. I listened to all of N voicemails while sitting at the same diner on Route 9, eating the same patty melt. My coffee was hot. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle. Outside, 3 miles up the road, the building where I'd spent 22 years of my life was presumably engaged in a very stressful afternoon. I drove home, helped my wife make dinner, and went to bed at 10. I should tell you about Sloane, because context matters. He came in 14 months ago with a mandate to modernize the compliance function, which translated in practice to cut headcount, replace institutional knowledge with software subscriptions, and present the whole thing as an efficiency gain to the board. He had done the same thing at 2 previous companies, both of which had subsequently had regulatory issues that he was no longer around to deal with. He was the kind of executive who was very good at the moment of the move and completely indifferent to what happens afterward. The restructuring looked good on paper. The org chart was cleaner. The headcount was lower. The word innovation appeared in more job titles. What the new org chart did not include was anyone who understood what the flags in the reporting module meant, how to correct them, or that the manual override process I'd built in 2019 was the only way to push corrected data to the compliance ledger without triggering an automatic SEC inquiry. I had documented all of this 3 separate times, in writing, with my signature. Kendall had been at the company for 6 weeks. He was a smart kid probably, but he had never been through a regulatory audit. He had never watched an examiner pull apart a discrepancy in a line item from 18 months ago and trace it back through 3 system handoffs. He did not know what he did not know, which is the most dangerous condition in compliance work. I knew this going in. I flagged it. I documented it. I left. The call I was actually waiting for came on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after my last day. It wasn't Sloane. It wasn't anyone from the company. It was an attorney. She introduced herself, told me she was with the SEC's Enforcement Division, and asked if I would be available to speak with her team at my convenience regarding an ongoing inquiry into my former employer's pre-IPO disclosures. I said yes. I said I had extensive documentation. I said I would be happy to cooperate fully. There was a brief pause. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "that's exactly what we were hoping to hear." I want to be careful here about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I did not go looking for this. I did not contact the SEC. I did not tip anyone off, whisper in anyone's ear, or take any action designed to make things worse for the company after I left. Every piece of documentation I had was documentation I'd created in the ordinary course of doing my job. Every warning I gave was a warning I gave through proper channels, in writing, before I left. What happened is this. When the pre-IPO review process began, the 3 flags surfaced. The company's new compliance team could not explain them in a way that satisfied the reviewers. The reviewers escalated. The SEC began a preliminary inquiry. In the course of that inquiry, they found my name on most of the relevant documentation. They called me. That's the whole story of how I ended up sitting in a federal office building on a Wednesday afternoon, going through 3 years of internal audit records with 2 SEC attorneys while my former employer's IPO was placed on administrative hold. The roadshow had been scheduled to begin that Friday. Sloane called me one more time, the night before I was scheduled to go in for my first interview with the SEC team. It was after 9 o'clock. I almost didn't answer. I answered. He didn't lead with pleasantries. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the transition, that the company valued my contributions, that there was a consulting arrangement they'd like to discuss if I was amenable. I let him finish. I told Kendall about the flags on my last day, I said. I have documentation showing I told him. I also have documentation showing I flagged the same issues to you, in writing, 3 weeks before my termination. There was a silence on the line. I'm cooperating fully with the SEC review, I said. I think that's the right thing to do. Good night. I hung up and went back to the book I'd been reading. My wife looked at me from across the room. Sloane? She asked. Sloane. She turned back to her book. Here is what the company did not know, and what I had not thought worth mentioning during my termination meeting. The manual override process I'd built in 2019 had a logging function. Everything that passed through it was time-stamped and attributed. When I had flagged the 3 issues internally, I had run them through the standard review protocol, which means they existed in the log. My flags were there. Kendall's non-response was there. The 6 weeks between my departure and the audit window were there, clearly showing no corrective action had been taken. The log was part of the system they'd kept running after I left. They had just never looked at it. The SEC attorneys found it on their second day of document review. One of them, a quiet man named Faulkner, who said almost nothing during our first meeting, looked up from his laptop and said, "You built a system that kept perfect records of itself." I'd built it to do exactly that, I said. I didn't want there to be any ambiguity. He almost smiled. The IPO was delayed by 11 months. Sloane resigned 4 weeks after the inquiry became public. He put out a statement about wanting to pursue other opportunities. His LinkedIn was updated within 48 hours. I'm sure somewhere, at some other company, someone is hiring him to modernize their compliance function. Kendall, to his credit, cooperated with the inquiry and was not personally sanctioned. He left the company shortly after, which was probably the smart move. Last I heard, he was in a different industry entirely. Good for him, honestly. He was in over his head from the beginning, and the people who put him there should have known better. The company eventually completed its IPO a year later, under a restructured compliance team with actual institutional knowledge. I read about it in the business section. They did fine. I was not offered a consulting arrangement during the SEC inquiry period, for what I'm sure were obvious legal reasons. Afterward, I did receive one offer, from a competitor, through a recruiter I'd worked with years ago. Senior Director of Compliance. Better title than I'd had. Considerably better salary. I took it. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something about the kind of work I did for 22 years. It's invisible work. When it goes well, no one notices. There's no quarterly highlight reel for nothing bad happened because someone spent 3 weeks going through these numbers. There's no bonus for the crisis that didn't occur. What you get instead is steady employment and the quiet knowledge that you are the load-bearing wall behind a building that looks much simpler than it actually is. The problem with being a load-bearing wall is that people sometimes forget you're structural. They look at you and see something that could be removed if they just rerouted around you. They are, in a technical sense, sometimes correct. You can reroute. You can run the load through new supports. But it takes time and expertise, and someone who understands how the original structure was built. What you cannot do is pull out the wall on a Tuesday and assume everything will be fine on Friday. I had been trying to explain this in various forms for the last 2 years of my time at that company. I explained it in meetings. I explained it in memos. I explained it in the documentation I left behind. I will not pretend the outcome wasn't satisfying. I am a person, not a saint. When the inquiry became public and I read the coverage and saw Sloane's resignation and understood what had happened, I felt something I can only describe as a very quiet, very complete sense of correctness. Not gloating, not anger. Just, yes. That is what was always going to happen. My daughter called me when the news broke. She'd seen it on her phone. "Dad," she said, "did you know this was coming?" "I knew it was possible," I said. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay." She laughed. "Good." There is a moment toward the end of my first day at the new company when my new manager, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who has the particular kind of focused intelligence I have always respected, walked me through the current compliance architecture and asked me what I thought. I took my time. I looked at the documentation. I asked about the system integrations. I asked who had built the reporting module and when. "It's been running since 2021, she said. "The person who built it left for a larger firm. We've been operating on institutional knowledge since then, which, honestly, is part of why we wanted someone with your background." I nodded. "There are going to be some things I want to look at closely in the first 60 days, I said. "That's exactly what we're hoping for," she said. I thought about Kendall. I thought about 11. I thought about 11 voicemails I had not returned and a log that kept perfect records of itself. "I'll document everything as I go," I said. "I always do." She smiled like that was the best thing she'd heard all week. Maybe it was. I thought a lot about what actually happened in that story. Not the legal part, not the IPO delay, not Sloane's LinkedIn update. Those are just events. What I keep coming back to is something simpler. Every consequence in that situation was built slowly, over years, by the choices people made when they thought no one was keeping score. Sloane chose to hollow out institutional knowledge, to make a org chart look cleaner. Kendall chose to glance up from his phone for 2 seconds and say, "I'll loop in the team." I chose to document everything, flag everything, and walk out with my head up. None of us knew exactly what was coming, but every one of those choices had weight. They accumulated, and then one day the audit window opened, and all that accumulated weight landed exactly where it was always going to land. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just arithmetic. I think about integrity the way I think about the systems I spent 22 years building. It's not visible when it's working. Nobody walks past a load-bearing wall and thinks about the load. They just live in the building. But integrity is structural. It's the thing that holds when pressure arrives, and pressure always arrives eventually. Sloane didn't believe that. He thought he could reroute around it. He thought the building would stand anyway. The intelligence part is harder to talk about without sounding arrogant, so let me try to be precise. I'm not saying I was smarter than Kendall. I'm saying I knew what I didn't know, and I spent 22 years paying close attention to exactly the things that made other people impatient. That's not genius. That's just the willingness to stay in a room with difficult, unglamorous work long enough to actually understand it. Sloane hired youth and confidence. He forgot that understanding is slow. It doesn't compress. You cannot innovation initiative your way to knowing what a regulatory flag means at 2 in the morning before a filing deadline. And then there's the question of what you do when it goes wrong for you anyway. When you do everything right and still get walked out with a cardboard box. I won't pretend that part was easy. The first few days I kept running the tape. What could I have said differently? Who else could I have told? Whether any of it would have mattered? It didn't matter. Sloane had made up his mind. The nephew was already hired. The decision was done. What I had left was how I handled it. I could have made calls I shouldn't have made. I could have taken documents I wasn't entitled to take. I could have gone small. Bitter, loud, the guy who made a difficult situation messier. I didn't. Not because I'm a saint, because I understood that my reputation, my documentation, my 22 years of doing the work correctly, that was the only real leverage I had. And it would only work if I kept it clean. Callahan walked out of that building with his integrity intact, and that turned out to be the only credential that actually mattered when the SEC called. I've told my daughter this, and she rolled her eyes the way she does when she thinks I'm being too composed about something. But I mean it plainly. The most durable thing you can build, in any career, is a record that speaks for itself when you're no longer in the room. Not a reputation, a record. Documented, timestamped, accurate. Sloane built a beautiful org chart. I built a system that kept perfect records of itself. One of those things was still useful 11 months later. The other one is on LinkedIn.